An empire can survive external enemies for generations, yet be undone when its own claims to moral authority become financially compromised. That was the paradox facing Europe in AD 1517. Christendom appeared unified beneath one church, one sacred language, one civilizational horizon. But beneath that grand facade, debts, rival jurisdictions, printers, princes, and wounded consciences were already assembling the machinery of fracture. The monk did not create the crisis. He revealed it. By the early 16th century, the Roman Church was not merely a religious institution. It was a transnational governing machine that reached across Latin Christendom through taxes, courts, bishops, privileges, patronage networks, and the immense prestige of sacramental power. It could absolve, adjudicate, appoint, punish, and command. For centuries, this system had served as the central architecture of Western unity. But systems built to govern souls are never dealing with souls alone. They are also dealing with land, money, status, fear, and political ambition. The grand question of AD 1517 was never simply theological. It was whether a vast institution could still command inward belief when too many of its outward mechanisms looked like extraction. The setting for this drama was not a stable Europe interrupted by one troublesome reformer. It was a continent already under immense strain. The Holy Roman Empire, despite its grand title, was not a centralized state. It was a mosaic of electors, princes, bishops, abbots, knights, free cities, and overlapping legal claims. Jurisdiction was fragmented, authority negotiated, enforcement uneven. In such a landscape, a challenge to Rome could not be smothered with the speed available to a more unified monarchy. Germany was not merely the place where the crisis occurred. Germany was the environment that made containment difficult. This mattered because papal power depended not only on spiritual reverence but on administrative reach. Appeals traveled to Rome. Revenues traveled to Rome. Prestige flowed upward, and obedience was expected in return. But that obedience rested on habits formed over centuries, and habits become vulnerable when institutions begin to treat trust as an inexhaustible resource. Rome required money on a colossal scale. The rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica symbolized magnificence, continuity, and sacred grandeur. But monumental beauty has a fiscal underside. Offices were sold. Benefices accumulated. Financial concessions were brokered through ecclesiastical channels. The traffic in indulgences, once a complex and bounded element of penitential theology, increasingly looked to many observers like spiritual privilege being translated into revenue. Once theology becomes visibly attached to debt servicing, the language of salvation begins to sound disturbingly similar to the language of accountancy. Yet the deeper danger was strategic, not merely moral. Europe was changing in ways older authorities did not fully comprehend. Universities had cultivated a class of trained disputants capable of reading, arguing, and denouncing with precision. Urban literacy was widening beyond clerical elites. Most transformative of all, the printing press had changed the speed of controversy. An argument once confined to a university hall could now become a continental event within weeks. Traditional authority still thought in terms of local correction. Print had created the possibility of systemic escalation. Wider pressures intensified every miscalculation. The Habsburg-Valois rivalry consumed attention across Europe. Ottoman expansion threatened Christendom's southeastern frontier. Claims to legitimacy were everywhere contested. Neither pope nor emperor could comfortably allow disorder. But neither possessed the freedom to address every threat at once. Overextension is not merely a military problem. It is a political condition in which every decision is made under constraint and every concession invites further tests. Thus the central tension of Europe on the eve of the Reformation was stark. The continent still spoke the language of one faith, but beneath that language lay competing sovereignties, local resentments, princely ambitions, financial burdens, and intellectual restlessness. A single spark, under calmer conditions, might have been extinguished. Under these conditions, a spark could become a continental fire. Into that world stepped Martin Luther, an Augustinian friar and professor at Wittenberg. Popular memory often compresses him into a heroic rebel who set out to destroy an empire of corruption. That version is too simple to be useful. Luther began inside the Church's intellectual world, not outside it. He was formed by scholastic argument, monastic discipline, biblical study, and the pastoral burden of sin and absolution. His initial outrage was directed not at Christianity's structure as such, but at what appeared to be a corruption of penance so severe that ordinary believers were being offered false assurance. In his view, souls were being harmed because forgiveness was being marketed in ways that severed repentance from spiritual transformation. That concern might have remained an internal reform dispute. But reform disputes become revolutionary when they expose how doctrine has been woven into finance. Johann Tetzel became the public face of indulgence preaching in German lands, and later memory turned him into the caricature of the shameless salesman. But reducing the affair to one flamboyant preacher conceals the true mechanism. The indulgence campaign was embedded in a larger financial structure linking Rome, Archbishop Albrecht of Mainz, and banking interests such as the Fuggers. This was not merely theology being vulgarized. It was theology functioning inside a debt system. Albrecht had accumulated multiple ecclesiastical offices and required papal approval to secure them. Such approvals were expensive. Loans and obligations followed. Indulgence revenue therefore served practical financial ends. A sacramental language of grace had become entangled with the machinery of office accumulation and debt repayment. To defenders of the system, this may have appeared normal, even necessary. Institutions always develop financial habits that their managers stop noticing. But to critics, this looked catastrophic, the cure of souls subordinated to fiscal expediency. Pope Leo X initially treated the affair as manageable dissent. This was one of the decisive strategic errors of the age. Rome understood the problem through the lens of discipline. A troublesome friar could be corrected, silenced, or absorbed. But Luther and his growing circle increasingly understood the conflict as a crisis of truth and authority. That difference in framing mattered more than any single decree. If Rome was confronting disobedience, then punishment could restore order. If Europe was confronting institutional falsehood, then punishment would only confirm the accusation. While Rome misread the nature of the danger, local powers saw opportunities that were not strictly theological. Frederick the Wise of Saxony is often portrayed as Luther's noble protector. Yet princely behavior in this period was rarely driven by pure abstraction. Frederick had reasons of territorial jurisdiction, university prestige, and political autonomy. Wittenberg's status mattered. Saxon rights mattered. Preventing outside authorities from seizing a professor within his territory also meant defending princely competence against external intrusion. In fragmented Germany, constitutional questions were never far from spiritual ones. Thus Luther's survival depended not only on conviction, but on the way his case intersected with existing struggles over who had the right to govern whom. Once that alignment formed, the controversy gained protectors who did not need to agree with every theological proposition in order to value the political advantage of resistance. Meanwhile, printers, scholars, and urban elites transformed the scale of the conflict. This was one of history's classic moments when a new communications environment outpaced inherited methods of control. Technical disputes were translated into sermons, pamphlets, woodcuts, polemics, and accessible arguments. Print did not create anger, but it gave anger velocity. It allowed scattered grievances to recognize themselves as part of a common cause. Authorities were still reacting to isolated texts. The public sphere was already assembling a movement. The 95 Theses of AD 1517 have often been treated as the instant beginning of the Reformation, complete with dramatic imagery of a hammer striking a church door. But the real significance of the Theses lies elsewhere. They mattered because they entered print culture and became a weapon against institutional credibility. Academic propositions, once circulated beyond their intended context, ceased to be merely academic. They became evidence that someone inside the system had named what many had quietly suspected. Institutions can often survive corruption. They struggle to survive corruption once it has been publicly articulated in a language others can repeat. At first, there was still room for containment. But every attempt to control widened the dispute. This is the pivot at the heart of the story. A controversy becomes irreversible when measures meant to suppress it instead redefine it at a higher level. Leipzig in AD 1519 was one such escalation. There Luther debated Johann Eck, a formidable defender of ecclesiastical authority. The issue moved beyond indulgences into far more dangerous territory. Could popes and councils err? Was the Church's interpretive monopoly absolute? Could earlier condemnations, even of figures such as Jan Hus, themselves be questioned? Once these questions were opened, the battlefield changed. This was no longer about abuse within a system. It was about whether the system's highest authorities could be fundamentally mistaken. Here the fog of war thickened. Luther was not operating with a complete blueprint for Europe's future. Rome was not confronting a fully organized revolution. Princes were not all calculating in the same way. Each actor saw only part of the board. But partial vision does not reduce danger. It often increases it, because men under uncertainty cling more fiercely to the assumptions that flatter their position. Rome assumed tradition would prevail. Luther assumed truth, once spoken, would expose corruption. Princes assumed the crisis could be used without fully unleashing it. Such assumptions are common in history. They are also commonly fatal. The election of Charles V in AD 1519 transformed the problem from a German controversy into a matter of imperial balance. Charles inherited a composite monarchy of astonishing breadth and fragility: Spanish kingdoms, Burgundian territories, Habsburg lands, claims and responsibilities that stretched across Europe and beyond. Grandeur in such cases is deceptive. The more territories a ruler commands, the more constituencies must be appeased, the more fronts must be watched, the more crises must be sequenced rather than solved. Charles needed unity, but lacked the freedom to impose it cleanly. Crushing Luther decisively risked alienating German princes whose support was essential. Tolerating dissent invited accusations of weakness. Foreign rivals observed closely. The Ottoman threat persisted. Every move in Germany had implications for the wider contest for European legitimacy. This is how empires become vulnerable, not through ignorance of danger, but through an excess of simultaneous obligations. Rome responded with the bull Ex Surge Domini in AD 1520, condemning Luther's teachings and threatening excommunication. In another age, such a document might have ended the matter. But by now the conflict had become theatrical, public, and symbolic. Luther burned the bull. This was not merely defiance. It was a declaration that authority itself was now on trial before Christendom. Such moments matter because they destroy the fiction that compromise remains easy. Once sacred commands are publicly rejected, each side must either retreat or intensify. Institutions trained to expect compliance often choose intensification, because to retreat would expose the fragility they most fear. The Great Collision came at the Diet of Worms in AD 1521. It remains one of the defining scenes in European history not because it offers a simple morality play, but because it condensed multiple incompatible necessities into one chamber. Charles V needed imperial order. The Church needed doctrinal submission. German princes needed to measure how far imperial authority could actually reach. Luther faced demands for recantation. The famous language of conscience has echoed through the centuries, but even here the grandeur should not obscure the strategic structure beneath it. This was a confrontation between universal authority and emerging limits on enforceability. The empire could pronounce. It could not effortlessly execute. Luther refused to recant. Charles condemned him. Yet condemnation did not lead to swift elimination. Frederick the Wise arranged Luther's protection. The outlaw survived. That gap between decree and enforcement changed Europe. Once a universal institution declares a man outside the law and fails to remove him, every observer learns the same lesson: power is no longer what it claims to be. This was the strategic paralysis at the center of the early Reformation. Officially, the case was settled. Practically, nothing was settled. The old order had named the dissenter illegitimate, but lacked the political freedom to extinguish him. Therefore reform did not die in martyrdom or vanish in silence. It institutionalized. During Luther's period in Wartburg, translation work advanced, especially the German New Testament, helping transfer sacred authority from an elite linguistic domain toward the vernacular. This was not merely literary achievement. It was a redistribution of interpretive power. Pamphlet warfare intensified. Sermons multiplied. Allies systematized doctrine. Local rulers and urban magistrates discovered that reform could be organized through schools, church ordinances, poor relief, and administrative restructuring. A protest became a program. Once protected territories began turning dissent into law, the conflict ceased to be about one friar and became a competition between governing models. But movements born in moral outrage rarely remain under the command of their founders. The Peasants' War of AD 1524 to AD 1525 revealed the explosive volatility of reform language once it entered a society dense with grievance. Calls for justice, scripture, and the correction of tyranny could be heard by peasants as well as professors. Social demands rose with theological ones. Here the great tension of the Reformation became unmistakable. Spiritual rebellion against corruption did not automatically align with political rebellion against hierarchy. Luther recoiled from the uprising and urged harsh suppression. This was not a minor footnote. It exposed a permanent fissure within reform movements. The denunciation of one authority does not determine which authority will replace it. Moral language can awaken expectations far beyond what its original authors intend to sanction. The result is often bitter disillusionment. A movement that promises renewal discovers that order still requires coercion, and idealists discover that reformers can become defenders of force once social breakdown threatens their preferred vision of stability. There was, therefore, no single Reformation in any simple sense. There were many Reformations: Lutheran, Reformed, Radical, and Catholic responses of renewal and discipline. Europe entered an age of confessional competition. Rulers learned that belief could be harnessed for state-building. Clergy could be disciplined, schools standardized, morals supervised, texts censored, loyalties categorized. Religion did not exit politics. It became one of politics' most powerful organizing instruments. This transformation altered the logic of sovereignty itself. Earlier Christendom had claimed a form of universal moral order above princes, however imperfectly realized. But confessional conflict pushed rulers to consolidate control within their own territories. Administration deepened. Surveillance sharpened. Doctrine and governance fused. The state learned to care about inward allegiance because inward allegiance affected outward obedience. What began as an argument over indulgences contributed to a reordered Europe in which conscience, law, education, and military planning were all increasingly entangled. The Peace of Augsburg in AD 1555 did not heal Christendom. It formalized fragmentation. Its famous formula acknowledged, in effect, that religious settlement would be tied to territorial rulership. Unity was not restored. Division was administered. That is one of history's coldest patterns. When reconciliation becomes impossible, systems often choose managed fracture. Such arrangements can produce temporary stability, but they also normalize the idea that truth, authority, and political jurisdiction can no longer be separated. Europe would continue to pay dearly for that reality. The deeper lesson of AD 1517 and its aftermath is not that one courageous man stood against corruption and changed the world, though courage indeed mattered. The deeper lesson is more unsettling. Institutions usually do not collapse in a single dramatic instant. They erode in stages. First, they confuse compliance for belief. Then they monetize legitimacy. Then they underestimate how new media can transform local dissent into systemic revolt. The Roman Church of the early 16th century still commanded immense obedience. But too much of that obedience had become procedural, inherited, and externally maintained. Such obedience looks solid until a crisis reveals that much of it was habit rather than conviction. Once financial scandal and doctrinal uncertainty fused in public view, old deference weakened with astonishing speed. The institution had mistaken long endurance for invulnerability. There is another lesson equally severe. Human beings often tolerate contradictions for remarkable lengths of time. They will serve institutions they privately distrust, repeat formulas they inwardly doubt, and preserve arrangements that no longer persuade them. But when a challenger names the contradiction with enough force, clarity, and timing, the silence surrounding the system begins to break. Revolutions of belief do not begin when corruption starts. They begin when corruption becomes undeniable in public language. Luther's endurance matters, then, not because he single-handedly shattered a monolith, but because his protest intersected with structures already under strain: fragmented sovereignty, overextended empire, church finance, princely ambition, printing networks, urban literacy, and a population increasingly prepared to suspect that sacred authority had become entangled with worldly appetite. In history, the decisive figure is often the one who arrives at the exact point where private resentment meets public mechanism. Then events accelerate beyond anyone's intention. That acceleration carries a warning. Leaders almost always believe they are managing a contained problem. Leo X thought discipline would suffice. Charles V believed condemnation could coexist with political necessity. Princes thought reform could strengthen autonomy without unleashing wider chaos. Luther believed theological correction could restore truth, but not all the social consequences that followed. Nearly every major actor misread the scale of the transformation underway. Such misreading is not an exception in history. It is one of history's governing constants. Men decide under pressure, with partial knowledge, inside institutions that reward certainty and punish hesitation. Therefore they often double down on frameworks already failing. The tragedy is not merely error. It is error made authoritative by office. The verdict, then, is severe. The monk shook an empire because the empire had already loosened its own foundations. The Church's entanglement with debt and patronage did not automatically guarantee revolt, but it destroyed the moral clarity required to command unchallenged obedience. The Holy Roman Empire's fragmentation did not create reform, but it gave reform room to survive. Print did not invent dissent, but it turned dissent into a continental force before old powers understood the battlefield. The true cost was the fracturing of Christendom and the birth of a new political age in which faith, sovereignty, and force would be bound together with terrible intensity. The modern mirror is impossible to ignore. Institutions in every age insist that legitimacy rests on principle. Yet again and again, their crises begin when ordinary observers conclude that principle has become a costume worn by financial interest, bureaucratic self-preservation, or elite bargaining. New media then enters, not as the creator of distrust, but as its amplifier and organizer. Authorities respond as though they are facing a disciplinary nuisance, while critics insist the problem is systemic. This pattern is not medieval. It is permanent. AD 1517 endures because it exposes a truth that civilizations prefer to forget: moral authority is strongest when it appears least interested in monetizing itself, and most fragile when it visibly trades sanctity for revenue, access, or protection. Once that trade becomes obvious, even a mighty order may discover that its obedience was always thinner than ceremony suggested. The final legacy question is therefore not whether one monk changed Europe. It is far more troubling, when a society continues to honor institutions it no longer truly believes in, what finally breaks first, the institution, the illusion, or the people who built their lives upon both. If this analysis was worth the time, subscribe for long-form historical examinations that treat great events not as isolated anecdotes, but as lessons in power, legitimacy, and human nature. And for the next part of this larger story, follow the video now appearing on the end screen. One final question remains. In the crisis of AD 1517, what mattered more, Luther's conviction, the printing press, or the political protection of the princes?